Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We're going to start our Sunday program now, inshallah. So if you can find a seat. I'll introduce you with your bio first, inshallah. I know it's just most of it. Assalamu alaikum. If everyone could please take a seat, we're going to start our Sunday program, inshallah. All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We have a very distinguished guest speaker for the second session of our Sunday program, Restorative Justice Bayan series, Dr. Najeeba Syeed, who will be presenting today on restorative justice in the criminal justice system. Dr. Najeeba Syeed is a peacemaker, healer, and scholar. She is the inaugural El Hibri Endowed Chair and Executive Director of Interfaith at Augsburg. She has been a professor, expert practitioner, and public speaker for the last 2 decades in the fields of conflict resolution, interfaith studies, mediation, education, deliberative democracy, social, gender, and racial equity. In 2021, she served as Chief of Staff to Council Member Nithya Rahman, the first Asian American woman elected Los Angeles City Council, to assist her with the setup of her office, hiring, strategic planning, legislative, and communication strategies. For the fall of 2020, she was Associate Professor of Muslim and Interreligious Studies at Chicago Theological Seminary, teaching 3 courses on management, indigenous religious movements, and interfaith leadership. She was an associate professor of interreligious education at Claremont School of Theology from 2010 to 2020 and is recognized as a leader in peace building and social justice-based research. Under her leadership, the 2 conflict resolution centers she led received the John Anson Ford Award for reducing violence in schools and in the area of interracial gang conflict, and was named Southern California Mediation Association's Peacemaker of the Year in 2007. She has chaired national conferences on Muslim and interfaith peacebuilding, served as a mediator in many cases, started restorative justice mediation programs in many institutions, including University of Southern California and several middle and high schools. Schools have reported a drop in disciplinary referrals and violence. Her track record as peacemaker and critical peace researcher has made her a sought-out advisor, and she has served as an on-the-ground peace interventionalist in conflicts around the globe. Dr. Syeed's peace and justice work has been the subject of news reports and documentaries, as well as this film, which is aired on NBC, Waging Peace, Muslim and Christian Alternatives. She was formerly the executive director of the Western Justice Center Foundation, founded by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals Judge Dorothy Nelson, and previous to that appointment was the executive director of the Asian Pacific American Dispute Resolution Center. Under her directorship of the organizations grew significantly in the areas of school-based interracial conflict resolution, anti-bullying initiatives, environmental mediation, restorative justice, cross-cultural conflict resolution training, gang intervention programs, community engaged design for youth violence prevention, and served a range of clients including Coca-Cola Company, UCLA, USC, Art Center College for Design, LAUSD, and the Department of Justice. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Najeeba Syeed.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We have a very short amount of time together, and I'm so glad. As many of you know, I now travel the country. I go between Minneapolis and Los Angeles. This is the mosque that my children grew up in. There was a parenting group. I was a part of that parenting group. Alhamdulillah, my kids are now 19 and 17, so I don't need to come to the parenting group, although I think my kids would probably say I should still be coming. So I'm delighted to be back in Los Angeles. So I wanted to really talk. We have a little bit amount of time. Bayan is the Islamic graduate school that sponsored this program. This summer, I taught imams restorative justice and conflict resolution in Chicago. It is a 40-hour semester-long course, so I'm going to give you a little taste of it. So restorative justice, as we're going to talk about here, is really based on this notion that part of the way we engage in justice is not retribution, it's not revenge. And sometimes we can think about it at the global level, the way that institutions such as governments, and we call it soft diplomacy, instead of ramping up to war, you try to engage in diplomacy, in soft power. So that's what you can do at the international setting, but we can also do it and utilize it in our families, in the ways that we build our institutions, in the ways that we approach conversations between parents and children, instead of working from a place of retribution, of revenge, we work from a place of restoration. So Howard Zehr is considered one of the fathers of restorative justice. Restorative justice comes from many different sources, but some of you may be familiar with Quakers and Mennonites. They are what we call the peace churches in the United States. So many of the Quakers were ones that initiated not subscribing to utilizing war for solving world problems. They were also some of the early abolitionists against the enslavement of people in the United States. There are many other forms. Ubuntu, many of you may have heard, is a form of restorative justice from many African nations utilized in South Africa. Many of you may be familiar with both Maori and Native Hawaiian practices, where instead of taking people into courts, people circle and they gather in a circle. And sometimes some of us scholars who study this say that you can actually talk a conflict to its end. If you just get people to keep talking and having a conversation. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what does a Muslim model of restorative justice look like, but also how can you think about implementing restorative practices in your daily life. Last week, Imam Jihad Safir, who's the Imam at Islah LA, which is on Slauson, who was a student of mine, a doctoral student of mine, spoke about restorative justice as well. And he utilizes it in his full-time Islamic school there. So one of the things that's really important is I want you to take a minute and I want you to turn to your neighbor and explain to them, when you think of the word justice, what's the image that pops up in your head? So just take a minute, turn to your neighbor. What is your metaphor for justice? Just introduce yourselves. This is part of restorative justice, is we have to get to know one another. So just turn to your neighbor and take 1 minute. What is your image? When you think of the word justice, what's the image? What's the symbol that pops in your head? You're lucky I make my students draw it, but now I'll just ask you to share it. So because we're also on a live stream, I just wanted to ask from the audience, what are some of the images that came up when we say the word justice? Does anyone want to share? What are some of the images? A scale? Okay, go ahead. Oh, I think there's someone in the back. Go ahead, yeah.
What's that lady with the blindfold?
The blindfold over her.
Yeah.
And she's holding scale. Okay, so that's an image of justice. That's in fact the image that is in many courthouses across the country. Any other images? Go ahead.
It's standing and thinking like it has to be this way, not the other way.
It has to be this way, not the other way. Okay, any other images of justice? Yes.
Like the first thing that came to my mind is like a prison or someone in prisons.
Yeah, prison. limiting someone else's freedom for a larger social good. That's how some people may think of it. So I wanted to give you some verses from the Quran. Let's take one more image. Any other images? Okay. So from the Quran, it's really important because we have to figure out what is our metaphor for justice. Because the way that we visualize and think about justice is how we implement it, right? The way that you imagine what justice looks like, just like I tell my graduate students, I want you to draw what peace looks like. The way that we create and think about, we implement from our imagery. That's part of how the human mind works. That's why the Muslim scripture, Christian, Jewish, all the scriptures are full of so many images. They're full of metaphors. So the Quran tells us, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانَ أَلَّا تَطْغَوْا فِي الْمِيزَانِ. So the Quran actually gives us in Surah Rahman, does anyone know what Rahman means? Compassion, the most compassionate. God is described as the most compassionate. In this surah, in this scripture from the Quran, God enumerates many of the natural parts of the world. Says, for instance, if you watch trees, eventually they even bow to God through what? Their shadows. Their shadows prostrate to God. God describes so many of the natural things that we have been given. So one of the ways I think about justice from this ayah from the Quran, from these various parts of the Quran, is that this is the couple of verses from Surah Rahman, is that heaven he has raised and imposed a balance, and that you not transgress the balance and establish equal weight and justice. Do not be deficient in this balance. So that in fact, justice is ecosystemic. It's an ecosystem in which we exist, whether it's with our natural, whether it's in our natural world, that justice is not just for human beings, but it's actually in the Quran, the environment is animated as being a part of justice, and that it's part of the balance. The Quran tells us also in another surah, Zilzal, that at the end of times, on the day of judgment, the earth will testify as to what humans have done to her. So in fact, justice is not just for you and me, it's even extended to this ecosystem. So who is in that ecosystem? What is beautiful is more and more as we study psychology and family systems theory, guess what our families are? They are also ecosystems. Guess what our organizations are? They are also ecosystems. So what the Quran tells us is that if we transgress that balance, God has created this beautiful balance. And that guess who transgresses it? It's human beings who transgress that balance. So that one thing we have to focus on when we are working in ecosystems is why I think the Muslim model of justice is restorative, is we don't just say, I'm here for what is good for me. I'm here for what retribution you did to me. When we're working with our children, whether it's an Islamic school, public school, whatever the setting is, and whatever the larger system of justice is, it's not just about getting what you need for yourself. For Muslims, there is a balance established by God. And part of what we are seeking is when that balance is transgressed, the whole ecosystem suffers. So I wanted to give you an example. Some of you were here for a conference we did a couple of months ago. My first restorative justice case out of law school, I walked into a room. There's a 9-year-old boy. His feet don't even reach the ground. This was a program in Centinela around Englewood, where young people who were first-time offenders were given the option to meet with the person whom they had victimized and have a conversation. So this 9-year-old boy, his feet are not even reaching the ground. And I asked him, I was not that far out of law school, and I asked him, we brought together the person whom he had done this transgression across. You know who she was? The ice cream truck driver in the neighborhood. So we brought them together, and I asked the ice cream truck driver, do you love this young boy? And she said, I love this young boy. He's a part of my community. And I asked the young boy, why did you take money that day? And he said, because I didn't have enough money for lunch. So an ecosystemic restorative approach would say, what is the bigger issue here? What is the bigger harm? Is it the harm that the child took the money? That is a harm. But what is the bigger harm here? Any ideas? The system who left a child hungry, right? So we were able to, instead of going to what we call retributive justice, this child being caught up in the legal system for the rest of their life probably, she said, I would like to mentor him in selling ice cream because I would like for him to one day learn how to have a business. So here we were able to give at the micro level a restorative approach. You know what happens if this young boy goes through the retributive justice system? Not only does he get caught in the justice system, he never gets to talk to the victim. The person who's victimized never gets a voice in that process. So I went on to do many of these mediations, particularly with people under the age of 18. We did it around shoplifting. So a lot of kids didn't know that if they took money from their local store, it impacted the prices of the store. They didn't know that that store was employing people from the neighborhood. So building an awareness of the ecosystem is a very important principle that we find not just today we're focusing on the Muslim principle, but it's also a way to think about when we do discipline in our own homes and in our own organizations and in our own ecosystems, putting at the front and center and in the middle, how is everybody impacted by this outcome? So some of the questions I'll ask when I'm dealing with very large conflicts, I work on major conflicts at city, state, and international levels. One of the questions I might ask is, who's benefiting from you guys being in conflict? Let's think about that right now. Whether it's international conflicts or local conflicts. I did a lot of interracial conversations in Pasadena for years, and the two communities that were meeting that were supposedly in conflict, one of the questions we asked is, who's benefiting from you all staying in conflict? And they were like, you know what? We're not benefiting. Someone else is benefiting. So we need to have a conversation about that. Another question I often ask in those situations is, are we in each other's futures? Can we build a future, an ecosystem together and a balance? So I just wanted to kind of have us think about this notion that at the heart of restorative justice isn't just my interest. There is a social scientist, he's since passed away, Robert Bellah, in his book, Habits of the Heart, says that we are in a time in America where we have the highest level of respect for individual sacred rights, but we are also at the time where the fabric that binds us together is at its weakest. So it's beautiful to have a recognition of individual rights, of my rights and your rights, but if we have nothing that binds us together, then we end up actually fraying the fabric, whether it's the fabric of our family, the fabric of our religious community, the fabric of our society. And I would argue that we live in a moment where revenge, retribution, Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, says another thing, the strength of a human being or the character of a human being, to summarize one of his sayings, is not about how you dominate over another, but it's how you restrain your anger. And by this, I'm talking about, how do we live in moments where instead of retribution and revenge, we can ask that bigger why? Why did this happen? Why did you do this? Can we get to the root causes of what is causing people to deal with issues and work on more collectively? So some of the stories from Prophet Muhammad's background and his life, his 23-year life mission as a prophet. So there's a story of Taif. Do you guys remember that story? Some of you may be learning it, and your kids may be learning in Sunday school. Prophet Muhammad is run out of this town of Taif by the children, humiliated, bleeding. And he's given the option as he leaves, as he's sitting under the trees, given the option for revenge. He is a prophet that has access. In the Muslim tradition, we believe in angels as well. We have some interfaith guests here too. He's given the option of potentially taking retribution and destroying that town. Does anyone remember what his decision was? Yes. So instead of doing retribution, he prayed for guidance for the whole community. So this is a moment. And does anyone remember there's another story so this was in a moment of weakness when he didn't have physical strength, when he didn't have material wealth. And then at the end of his prophethood, he returns to Mecca, and what does he do to the people that wronged him and his community? He has the option for revenge and retribution. He's given that option. What did he do when he was in a position of material strength? Meant 23 years later. He freed everyone and gave them asylum. So I think these are really powerful examples, because one of the things what he did is he said, I am here to build a larger ecosystem. The health of the ecosystem is important. If I'm going to be able to work with this village, even though I'm here in this moment humiliated, I could work from a place of revenge. I could have destroyed those that disagreed with me. I could have annihilated them. Instead, what happens later to Taif, that village, that city? It becomes one of the greatest allies in his prophethood. What happens to the people who get asylum after he gets and gains so much power? It was a 23-year mission. Many of them become part of the community. So I think one of the things we want to think about is in our message around restoration over retribution is doing it. One of the things I really want to point out here, though, Prophet Muhammad didn't do away with accountability. Accountability was very much centered in the process. So it's not like you did something happened, I'm going to forget it and put it aside. There was accountability was always a part of the conversation. And I wanted to talk about this from from the Quran, from the scripture of Muslims. Retribution for an evil act is an evil one like it. But whoever pardons and makes reconciliation, his reward is due from Allah. He does not like wrongdoers. There's another saying of Prophet Muhammad, God does not show compassion to those who do not show it to others. One of the reasons that I think is really important around these sayings from the scripture is that our way in which we treat other human beings is a sign of piety for how God will treat us. So if I'm praying, I'm fasting, I'm doing everything that a Muslim is to do under the 5 pillars, but I walk out of the masjid and spit on an unhoused neighbor next door, or I do and take retribution on someone else, God is looking at how we treat our fellow human beings. Prophet Muhammad said, God will not show you compassion if you do not show compassion to others. So one of the things is, I'm thinking about this as a parent. It's funny, I used to tell people I would do conflict resolution training for parents before I had children. Anything I said before I had kids, just scratch it, because I don't know what I was doing trying to tell people. But this is why we have to think about even things like parenting. Are we using an authoritarian approach? Is it because I said so? Is that the only reason that your child is in? What are they learning about the ecosystem? They're learning that this ecosystem is authoritarian, and the reason they have to do something isn't because it's the right or the wrong thing to do. It's because they have to fear their parent. So what does it mean when we are leaders, whether it's in our families, in our communities, where we lead out of fear instead of inspiration? One of the things that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ did, upon him be peace, is lead out of inspiration, out of love, not out of fear. If you talk to his companions, the people that were surrounding him, they didn't say, I came to this religion, I followed this person because I was afraid. They say because out of love. And what did he do for many of them? We think about the many who were persecuted in very physical ways. He was a place and a space and a person who offered so much ability to grow. So there's a virtue to forgiveness that the Quran tells us. And what's important here is not just the pardon, but the act of reconciliation. There's something here about reconciliation where it's not just that you give forgiveness, but you give it under the conditions where people are willing to work with one another. Does that make sense? Because sometimes we push people to forgiveness, but all the parties, and that's what restorative justice is based on, all of the parties must be willing to make it right, must be willing to do the repair. And I think we have to be very careful that we don't utilize these kinds of processes to further harm people. So if not everyone in this situation is willing to work together, to move towards building relationships, then you might actually create more harm. So I think it's very important that we think about, look at the Quran. The second part of it is not just that we pardon, but that we're with relationship and in relationship in that ecosystem with one another so that we build that relationship. The other thing is, for the Muslim process, there is a process of forgiveness in which we pursue it with the other human being and we pursue it with God. So we turn to God and ask for forgiveness. But how many of you know the practice around Ramadan? And for Muslims, we have a yearly practice of seeking out from other human beings that we've wronged. I try to do this every Ramadan to start with a clean slate, to say, I have harmed you. I seek for your forgiveness, and I understand if you can't give it. The other part of that reconciliation is to ask, what can I do to make it better for you? So we can ask God for forgiveness, but other human beings, that process of forgiveness means that they have to be willing to reconcile, and we have to understand the steps that we have to go through for reconciliation. So I think it's very important, because there can be a culture that says, forgive, 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 but it doesn't mean forget. It means we have to have accountability. And the person who was harmed, as I mentioned to you in this case where I was talking about a young boy and an ice cream truck owner, she was able to articulate what she wanted to do out of that harm and that situation. So I just wanted to point out, when we talk about forgiveness, it's not a one-sided approach. It's not only that you forgive and you forget, but that you work towards an understanding of reconciliation, and that's a process. By the way, sometimes it can take years. We may not be able to do it instantaneously. We may not be able to build a relationship. Maybe you have to work on trust. Maybe you're not ready to meet the person that harmed you. Maybe you're not willing or ready or able to be in that place. I've worked on many cases in which the violence has been extreme, and some people choose that option and others don't, and that's their right to make that decision. I think it's really important, because forgiveness has sometimes been used as a weapon to push people when they're not ready, or to utilize it in a way that furthers harm. So I want to make sure we don't do that. So some of the things that I think are really important in thinking about restorative justice and restorative practices in our communities and in our criminal justice system, which I don't think I'm going to get as much time to focus on today. But one of the things is, restorative justice is based on empathy. And one of the things that Imam al-Ghazali says is that when you have empathy for someone, you actually feel pain. And he says, if you can see someone, if you can see someone else in pain and you feel nothing, then something is actually wrong with you. So the first part of it is, so when I just want to tell all of you that if you're looking and if you're looking at images of people suffering from pain and you're not feeling anything, then there's something happening within us. So the fact that we feel pain when we see the image, or when our brother or sister is experiencing pain, that is actually a part of our being human. So Imam al-Ghazali says that empathy, which is the basis of restorative justice, is embodied. It's felt in your body. It's not just intellectual. A lot of times I go to lectures where people approach restorative justice as an intellectual exercise. It's actually an embodied process that we feel. One of the things that is really beautiful about the basis for restoration within the Muslim community, many of us know the saying of Prophet Muhammad, thinking the continuation of the body, is that the ummah, or the people of Islam, Muslims, are like a body. When one part hurts, the whole body hurts. So this notion of empathy. And right now we live in a moment, by the way, where empathy is under attack, where we're being told that empathy is problematic, that empathy is weak. But we think as Muslims, empathy is actually not just part of our religious belief, but it's part of how we build that ecosystem of justice. So this principle of the ummah as a body, that when one part of when one part of the Muslim community hurts, we all feel it. It's this intertwined empathy. There's another beautiful, I really spend a lot of time on embodiment, because one of the things that I would say is a lot of retributive justice is focus on exerting equal physical harm on the person who harmed us and the perceived harm. And that, in fact, continues the cycle of harm. So what about and thinking in ways in which we restore relationships and interrupt cycles of harm and trauma? So the Quran tells us that the body, every human body, is ahsan al-taqweem, the most excellent and beautiful of creations. So another thing that we need to think about when we're implementing systems of justice is, how do we protect this body, this concept of no harm? So I think that's really important, that we think about this notion of no harm to the body. When I talk about conflicts, I talk about 4 different levels. The first is intrapersonal. That's in your own soul. So Muslims believe in that intrapersonal struggle. What do we call it? Jihad an-nafs, the internal struggle that we have in ourselves to make the right choice, to choose good action over harm. So that's intrapersonal, within ourselves. Then there's interpersonal, between people. So really, when we can think about, the first example is interpersonal. The third is community level. So the ummah, thinking about things as a community. The fourth is structural. So when we think about these 4 layers of how harm and peace exist, that sometimes I would argue, I'm going to mention now here, one of the ways society? Does he have a voice in the system of justice? Is he a part of the procedures that impact him? The communities that are most impacted by a problem are the experts. They are the ones who know the solutions. Are we hearing their voices? Thinking about how our communities are impacted in this moment, do we have a voice in the solutions that we are trying to pursue for our communities? Another thing that I think is really important is what we call nonviolent communication. The parenting group that I was a part of for many years, that some of you just joined us from, if you haven't been trained in nonviolent communication, I highly recommend it. Nonviolent communication is where even how we treat one another. So Prophet Muhammad said, do not be angry. And he repeated this 3 times. On another occasion, the Prophet asked his companions, do you know who the strong person is? And his companions replied, thinking about this is 1,500 years ago. What did his companions say? Oh, it's the person who can wrestle the other down. But Prophet Muhammad said, no, it is actually the person who can control their anger. So this dynamic of justice, the metaphor of justice being retribution, the metaphor of justice for me versus the ecosystemic, this is a struggle that has been present in human society for more than 1,400 years, because the first thing his companions are saying, yes, wrestle someone to the ground, that's the strongest. And Prophet Muhammad is trying to say, no, actually, it's when you use nonviolent communication. So I'll just give you an example. I do this with my students. I was talking to one of my friends. She has a 2-year-old. One of the people that I work with very closely, she was telling me she was talking to her 2-year-old niece. So her 2-year-old niece is right here, and she's talking to her 2-year-old niece, but what she's actually doing is looking at the television. So do you know what her 2-year-old niece did? The 2-year-old niece came and took her aunt's face, moved it towards her, and just kept talking. So as young as 2 years old, we know whether or not someone is actively listening to us. The Quran says every human being is given dignity. Meaning we are born with dignity. For those of you right now who are struggling with feeling marginalized, feeling that you're in pain, remember that it's not other human beings that give you dignity. Dignity is the sacred birthright of every human being given by God. So you are born with dignity. No one can take your dignity from you. One of the things that we are finding is, we are calling it, for those of you who are not familiar, but there's something called symbolic humiliation, where you take people who represent a community and you publicly humiliate them, you violate their dignity, because guess what everyone else does? When you see someone who looks like you, sounds like you from your community, and they're publicly humiliated, what happens is that you self-regulate and you don't start challenging whatever it is that your community is facing. Did everyone hear what I said? So that's called symbolic humiliation. We're now finding more and more, and this is why restorative justice is important, we're finding that the violations that create and the most generational trauma are not as much physical harm, but what we call dignity violations. Does everyone know what those are? Dignity violations are violations to the human respect and capacity to feel respected. So dignity violations. And sometimes it's interesting because we think we're trying to help people, but I'll give you an example of some dignity violations. I was working with someone on international aid, and they were saying, you know, we have this time every Friday that we give out checks. This was in another country where they were giving aid. They said, we don't know why people are not showing up. And we had a conversation with them. What we found out is if you stand in line showing publicly that you don't have the money to get resources, what does that mean? And I would argue we live in a moment where instead of creating systems that build human dignity and restoration, we live in a moment that actually cuts dignity down, where we're trying to build systems that take away dignity. But I just wanted to share that with you. And that was really, we have so little time today. Next time, inshallah, we can talk about the criminal justice system, but I wanted to share with you the Muslim Foundation for our engagement around issues of restoration. And I hope that this idea of justice as ecosystemic, as interdependent, is a message that comes from 1,500 years ago, but it resonates with us in a way that gives us hope for resilience and support for one another, whether it's for our Muslim friends or our neighbors of every other religious tradition, that we all are born with dignity and that we can support one another in restoring relations. This is the Dhuhr prayer now, so I'm going to hand it over. Oh, okay. So they're doing the Iqam. Okay. So I have we have another couple of minutes. I thought it might be good to take questions from people in the audience. If you want to just introduce yourselves. Are there any questions? Yo, okay.
So what do we do in situations where forgiveness is really not an option?
So I think that it's such an important question, and I think it's so wide and so broad to ask, to give you an answer for a particular situation. I would also say that sometimes forgiveness is symbolically different in different cultures. A lot of these words that we just use generally, like forgiveness, harm, like they can be different in different communities and cultures. So one of the things that I think is important that I do is sometimes in a restorative process, when there isn't someone who's willing to forgive, I will sometimes find a proxy where someone has experienced a similar harm and have the person who transgressed that harm listen to what that experience was like. So, for instance, if I have a victim that has a concern or an issue, I might find someone who has had a similar experience so that the person who's transgressed can hear what that experience is like. That's one option. Another option is, I think when we talk about forgiveness, is we have to, I don't know if the person isn't willing to forgive because they're just not there. And that's
Like something egregious, something really like not stealing, not a kid stealing, something horrible. I don't want to,
Yeah, no, you don't have to. And I also think that it has to come in relationship with mental health care, mental health counseling, that we have to be really careful if someone is a victim of a very serious crime, that we don't push to forgiveness. One of the things that I think is really important is for people who are not a party to that exact conflict, sometimes we as outsiders will put the victims on blast. So what I mean by that is we have to be very careful as leaders, whether it's in a school community, in a religious community, in a public place, that we don't want to name victims when they're not ready. I've seen further harm done where people have named victims and said, so-and-so was harmed. And it's like, did you get their permission? Because what can happen to the victim is they can get re-traumatized by the public display of their harm. So sometimes if forgiveness is not an option, I think that we have to ask, well, why is it not an option? And sometimes there are protective measures that are in place that may not make it an option. I think the other thing we have to be really careful about is also thinking about when is the right time for forgiveness and who puts that timeline together and what does that look like? And does it mean you have to bring people in the same room? I've done shuttle diplomacy where I go back and forth between people because they don't want to meet. And that's also okay. And the question that I always ask is, is reconciliation justice? That was another question I asked. Are we in each other's futures? Who is human? And I ask, is reconciliation justice? For some people, they're not at the place where reconciliation is justice for them. And that's the reality. And if it's not justice for them, that's something that we have to accept and work with. And I think the question is, whenever people are pushing for forgiveness, I always ask, why are you asking? Who are you asking? And how are those people going to get to the place where forgiveness is meaningful for them? I even think about this with kids. Like with my kids, I'll be like, say sorry. And I'm like, wait, what does that mean to them? What are they saying? Is it meaningful? Is it mean something to them? So those are all things that I think are really important. So thank you for that question. I will also say I have worked on very serious situations where people want to forgive. And I could never imagine myself forgiving, but they want to forgive. So that's raised interesting questions for me as a mediator. What if someone wants to forgive something of their own accord? Do I give or take that agency away from them because I think it's too much? This is also why I think I'm working on my third book, which is Spirituality of Restorative Justice. I do think that that's why spirituality and religion, instead of, we always talk about spirituality and religion instigating conflict, I also think spirituality and religion allow people to forgive. That connection to a divine allows us to forgive in ways that we may not be able to if it was just us. So I'm just giving, and in the book, I talk about some of the case studies where I could never, if I was in that situation, I'd be like, that's not what I would do. But it's a good ethical question to ask. Who and how does forgiveness happen? And that's where I think that ecosystemic approach and Mizan, the idea of justice in our definition, is less about the scale being heavier and lower, but it's more about the balance between everyone in that scenario, that someone may be willing to forgive for the ecosystem, and who makes that decision, and do we have spaces that people can make those decisions? I don't know. Those are really good questions. Let's take one more question.
I don't want that. Oh, you want to say without it? Okay. So I'm going to read something. The United States has opposed resolutions at the United Nations to establish food as human right. With the most recent vote in 2021 being against, a United Nations committee draft asserting food as a fundamental right joined only by Israel. And as a Muslim, we might feel differently, we might think differently. How do we reconcile in this situation, because the United States think different than us, and we're American Muslims? Do we fight back to country that we live in? What do we do?
So I think you raised a question. And in fact, there have been a lot of ways in which when we talk about human dignity, people have been talking about housing as a human right. So it's not just hunger, but housing as a human right. There are many ways in which the notion of what are human rights have been expanded across many issues. So I just wanted to say this is a discourse that's happening across our city, actually. There are people who say, well, housing is a human right. We should be guaranteed to have housing. So how do we engage and have that conversation? So I think I had talked about earlier different levels of how we organize social and other forms of justice. So there's the interpersonal, community, and structural. So I would say that one of the ways in which your question can come up is that it's also helpful to think about, well, how do I have, and what is the position of my community to be able to organize to impact the structural? How do we have a voice? Are we in places where what I think is a human right should be addressed? Are there Muslims represented in that conversation? I will tell you, in a lot of conversations locally at the state level, it would be great to see more Muslims talk about hunger as a human right. And it doesn't always have to be focused on the outside or international, but also locally. And I think, so I would just encourage us to think about, for you, however you define human dignity, is there a way in which that ecosystemic, that restorative approach to justice isn't just something we talk about with each other, but that we're showing up for spaces? Maybe we need to have a conversation at this mosque about hunger as a human, food as a human right. Maybe we think about the neighborhood. Are there grocery stores for our neighbors who don't have access to food? So there are many ways in which we can have these conversations. So I would just encourage us not to give up and to think about the interpersonal level, the community level. So maybe you can't change the whole structure up here, but if communities come together, and maybe it's also sometimes we have, and we talk to our Catholic brothers and sisters and say, is this an issue? I'm just giving you an example. Is this an issue that you believe in too? Can we together work together towards advancing? Because I think sometimes it feels overwhelming. So I would just encourage you to think about, well, what can I do? Particularly right now, I just want to share with all of you, those of you that have teenagers, they are feeling the need for agency to have and play a role in advocacy for the human rights that they believe in. So I think sometimes they can't work at the huge structural level, but really empowering them to think about what we can do. The number one reason that change doesn't happen is because people believe it won't. And they believe it's not actually the biggest problem we run up against is apathy, which means no caring at all. So it's not actually that we care too much, it's that the vast majority of people don't show up because they're not even asked. So I would say before we jump into spaces where we close the doors, I was a professor for a class in which I had Muslim, Jewish, and Christian students after October 7th. So in my class, we had a lot of dialogue. And one Christian student came up to me after class and she said, Professor Syeed, I've never heard of Gaza. I didn't know what it was. And I could have just shut her down and said, I'm sorry, why don't you know? And this is what I had to say was, you know what, let's talk about this, the history, let's talk about this. So I just want to share that with you. There are a lot of people who don't know stuff, and that can be in our own communities. So one stance could have been to the student, that's it. I'm going to write you off. You have no perspective. But I said, why don't you talk to your fellow students? They have different perspectives, have a conversation. So I just wanted to point that out too, is that not everyone shows up with the passion and the viewpoints that I have. How do I empower people to do that discovery? And particularly, I teach 17 to 21-year-olds as a professor now. I used to teach older students. So I'm having to learn, how do some people show up with passion and understanding? Maybe they have that embodied experience, that we talked about. But how do we show up for people that are just learning, just growing, and maybe making room at the table for them too? I do think I don't want to come between people's prayers, so we want to get ready for prayer, and I'm going to have to end here. It's unfortunately it's time for the horror, but I'm happy to stay after and talk to people. And if you would like to all have conversation with each other. If you need to pray the horror, they're praying in the back. So we'll do it.
Thank you so much, Professor Najeeba Syeed, for that beautiful and inspiring presentation. So please join us for Doha prayer right now in our ICSC prayer hall. And afterwards, we have our Sweet Treat social in our social hall, and we have our Quran memorization class in this class. So please join us, and please come next Sunday. In addition to our Sunday program, next Sunday we have a special webinar, Children of Genocide. It's going to start at 9 a.m. over Zoom, and it will be live streamed on the Facebook and YouTube. So please join us. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.